In the 1960s and 70s, our grandmothers knew how to make candies that mattered. Their work in the kitchen didn't just fill cookie tins, it created dozens of varieties, candies that have been lost to time. These 60 forgotten Betty Crocker candies from the 1960s might sound too complicated today. Let's rediscover the forgotten candies from the 1960s that nobody makes anymore. Divinity candy with pecans wasn't store-bought. It was sugar, egg whites, and corn syrup beaten by hand until your arm ached and the mixture turned glossy, white, and held stiff peaks. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made divinity for special occasions because it was elegant, inexpensive, and required no expensive ingredients beyond patience and timing. You boiled sugar and corn syrup to the hardball stage, or poured it slowly into beaten egg whites while someone else held the bowl steady, then beat the mixture until it thickened and lost its shine. You folded in chopped pecans, dropped spoonfuls onto wax paper, and let them dry overnight on the kitchen counter. The candy was light, airy, and tasted like pure sugar with a faint vanilla sweetness. The texture was chewy crispy, almost like meringue, but denser. The pecans added crunch and a buttery flavor that balanced the sweetness. It melted on your tongue slowly, leaving a grainy, sugary coating. Divinity disappeared when humidity, electric mixers, and impatience made it too risky. One humid day ruined the batch, and younger generations stopped wanting to beat egg whites for 20 minutes. But if divinity felt too delicate, what came next was hard, crunchy, and required a cast-iron skillet you couldn't replace. Peanut brittle made in cast iron wasn't candy. It was molten sugar and raw peanuts cooked to the edge of burning, then poured onto a buttered countertop to cool into sheets you cracked with a hammer. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made peanut brittle year-round because it was cheap, impressive, and used ingredients they already had: sugar, corn syrup, butter, baking soda, and raw peanuts from the bulk bin. You cooked everything in a cast-iron skillet over medium heat, stirring constantly with a wooden spoon until the mixture turned amber and smelled like caramel. You poured it fast onto a buttered surface, spread it thin with a spatula, let it cool until it hardened, then broke it into jagged pieces. The brittle was golden, glossy, and then tasted like burnt sugar, butter, and roasted peanuts. The texture was glass-hard, crunchy, and shattered when you bit down. It stuck to your teeth and dissolved slowly, coating your mouth with sweet, nutty flavor. Peanut brittle disappeared when candy thermometers became standard, and younger cooks stopped trusting their instincts to judge temperature by color and smell. The cast-iron skillet sat unused, and the countertops were no longer buttered for candy making. But if peanut brittle felt too hard, what came next was soft, creamy, and required nothing but a wooden spoon and patience. Chocolate fudge with walnuts wasn't a candy. It was a test of timing, temperature, and knowing when to stop stirring before the sugar crystallized and ruined everything. Our grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made fudge year-round because it was rich, impressive, and required no special equipment beyond a heavy saucepan and a candy thermometer they didn't trust. You boiled sugar, cocoa, butter, and milk to the softball stage, removed it from heat, added vanilla, then beat it with a wooden spoon until it thickened and lost its shine. You folded in chopped walnuts, poured it into a buttered pan, scored it into squares, and let it set overnight. The fudge was dense, creamy, and tasted like chocolate, butter, and sugar with a faint graininess that meant you'd beaten it just right. The walnuts added crunch and a slight bitterness that balanced the sweetness. It melted slowly on your tongue, coating your mouth with chocolate flavor that lingered. This fudge disappeared when younger generations stopped wanting to stand at the stove stirring, stopped trusting themselves to judge doneness without a thermometer, and started buying fudge in stores instead. But if fudge felt too rich, what came next was light, sweet, and required dipping each piece by hand. Coconut bonbons dipped in chocolate weren't store-bought. They were sweetened condensed milk, shredded coconut, and powdered sugar rolled into balls, chilled, then dipped in melted chocolate one at a time. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made bonbons for special occasions because they were elegant, required no baking, and looked impressive in gift boxes lined with tissue paper. You mixed sweetened condensed milk with shredded coconut and powdered sugar until it formed a thick, de-sticky dough, rolled it into small balls, chilled them until firm, then melted chocolate in a double boiler and dipped each ball with a fork, letting the excess drip off before placing them on wax paper to harden. The bonbons were sweet, creamy, and tasted like coconut and chocolate, with a texture that was dense, chewy, and slightly grainy from the powdered sugar. The chocolate shell was thin and snapped when you bit down, revealing the soft coconut center. They were rich, filling, and required eating slowly to avoid overwhelming sweetness. Coconut bonbons disappeared when dipping chocolate became harder to find in grocery stores, and younger generations stopped wanting to dip candies by hand. But if bonbons felt too sweet, what came next was darker, richer, and tasted like molasses and brown sugar instead of white. Panouche wasn't chocolate fudge. It was brown sugar, butter, and cream cooked until it thickened into a caramel-colored candy that tasted like burnt sugar and nostalgia. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made panouche year-round because it was different, cheaper than chocolate, and used brown sugar they kept in the cupboard year-round. You boiled brown sugar, butter, and milk to the soft ball stage, removed it from heat, added vanilla, then beat it with a wooden spoon until it turned thick and grainy. You poured it into a buttered pan, scored it into squares, and let it set overnight on the counter. The panouche was pale brown, dense, and tasted like caramel, butter, and molasses with a faint maple sweetness. The texture was creamy but slightly grainy, somewhere between fudge and taffy. It melted slowly on your tongue, leaving a buttery, sugary coating. Panouche disappeared when brown sugar fudge became less recognizable than chocolate, and younger generations stopped making candies that required beating by hand and judging doneness by feel. These first 5 candies weren't just sweets. They were tests of skill, patience, and knowing when to stop stirring. But the next 5 required even more. Timing you couldn't fake, ingredients you had to handle carefully, and hands that knew how to pull taffy before it cooled and hardened. Molasses taffy pulled by hand wasn't candy. It was molten sugar, molasses, and butter cooked to the hard crack stage, and then pulled and stretched between buttered hands until it turned glossy, pale, and brittle. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made taffy for special occasions because it was cheap, impressive, and required teamwork. One person held one end while the other pulled, stretched, and folded it back on itself dozens of times. You boiled molasses, sugar, butter, and vinegar until it reached 260 degrees Fahrenheit, poured it onto a buttered surface, let it cool just enough to handle, then buttered your hands and pulled it until your arms ached and the taffy turned light brown and shiny. The taffy was chewy, sticky, and tasted like molasses, butter, and burnt sugar with a faint tang from the vinegar. The texture was dense and required chewing slowly to avoid pulling out fillings. It stuck to your teeth and dissolved gradually, coating your mouth with dark. In sweet flavor, molasses taffy disappeared when younger generations stopped wanting to burn their hands on hot sugar and stopped having someone else to pull with. But if taffy felt too dangerous, what came next was simpler, lighter, and required nothing but melted chocolate and a piece of wax paper. Peppermint bark on wax paper wasn't fancy. It was melted chocolate poured thin, sprinkled with crushed peppermint candy, then cooled until it hardened, and you broke it into jagged pieces. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made peppermint bark year-round because it was fast, required no special equipment, and used leftover peppermint candies from the candy jar. You melted chocolate chips in a double boiler, poured it onto a sheet of wax paper spread flat on the counter, sprinkled crushed peppermint candy on top while the chocolate was still wet, then let it cool at room temperature until it hardened. You peeled the bark off the wax paper and broke it into pieces with your hands. The bark was thin, crispy, and tasted like dark chocolate and peppermint with a sharp cooling burn from the candy. The texture was crunchy, brittle, and shattered when you bit down. The peppermint pieces were sharp and dissolved slowly, leaving a minty aftertaste. Peppermint bark disappeared when white chocolate versions became trendy and younger generations stopped making it on wax paper and started buying it in fancy tins instead. But if peppermint bark felt too simple, what came next required patience, precision, and candied fruit peel most people threw away. Candied orange peel dipped in chocolate wasn't candy. It was citrus peels. Most people threw away, boiled in sugar syrup until they turned translucent and chewy, then dipped in melted chocolate and left to harden. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made candied orange peel for special occasions because it was elegant, used something that would otherwise be waste, and tasted expensive without costing much. You peeled thick strips of orange rind, boiled them 3 times to remove bitterness, then simmered them in sugar syrup until they turned soft and glossy. You drained them, let them dry overnight, then dipped each piece in melted chocolate and placed them on wax paper to set. The peel was chewy, sweet, and tasted like orange, sugar, and dark chocolate with a faint bitterness underneath. The texture was dense, sticky, and required chewing slowly. The chocolate added richness and balanced the citrus sharpness. Rum balls rolled in powdered sugar weren't baked. They were crushed vanilla wafers, cocoa powder, corn syrup, and dark rum mixed by hand, rolled into balls, then coated in powdered sugar until they looked like snowballs. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made rum balls for adult parties because they were no-bake, required no special equipment, and used up stale cookies no one wanted to eat. You crushed vanilla wafers into fine crumbs with a rolling pin, mixed them with cocoa powder, corn syrup, chopped pecans, and a generous pour of rum, then rolled the sticky mixture into small balls and coated them in powdered sugar. You stored them in tins for a week to let the flavors meld. The rum balls were dense, moist, and tasted like chocolate, rum, and vanilla, with a faint sweetness from the corn syrup. The texture was soft, slightly crumbly, and dissolved slowly on your tongue. The powdered sugar coating added a sweet contrast to the boozy interior. Rum balls disappeared when younger generations stopped keeping rum in the house and stopped wanting candies that tasted strongly of alcohol. The tin sat empty, and the recipe was forgotten. Cherry cordials with liquid centers weren't store-bought. They were maraschino cherries wrapped in fondant, left to liquefy, then dipped in chocolate and stored until the centers turned syrupy and sweet. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made cherry cordials for special occasions because they were impressive, elegant, and required a technique few people knew. The fondant mixture broke down over time, turning solid sugar into liquid inside the chocolate shell. You made fondant from sugar, water, and cream of tartar, wrapped each cherry in a thin layer, let them rest for a day, and then dipped them in melted chocolate and stored them in a cool place for 2 weeks until the centers liquefied. The cordials were sweet, rich, and tasted like cherry, sugar, and dark chocolate with a syrupy center that burst when you bit down. Opera fudge wasn't chocolate. It was white fudge made with sugar, butter, and cream, studded with chopped maraschino cherries and walnuts, then cut into squares and wrapped in wax paper. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made opera fudge for special occasions because it was different, elegant, and looked impressive in gift boxes. You boiled sugar, butter, and cream to the softball stage, removed it from heat, added vanilla, then beat it until it thickened and turned creamy white. You folded in chopped cherries and walnuts, poured it into a buttered pan, scored it into squares, and let it set overnight. The fudge was pale, dense, and tasted like vanilla, butter, and sweet cherries with crunchy walnut pieces throughout. The texture was creamy but slightly grainy, and the cherries added bursts of color and tartness. Opera fudge disappeared when white fudge became less popular than chocolate, and younger generations stopped recognizing it as a classic candy. The recipe faded, and the name became a mystery. But if opera fudge felt too sweet, what came next was pressed by hand, melted on your tongue, and tasted like pure peppermint. Buttermints, pressed in molds, weren't store-bought. They were powdered sugar, butter, cream, and peppermint extract kneaded into dough, pressed into tiny molds shaped like flowers or shells, then left to dry until they hardened. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made buttermints for weddings, showers, and parties because they were elegant, inexpensive, and melted on your tongue like snow. You mixed softened butter with powdered sugar and a few drops of cream until it formed a smooth dough, added peppermint extract and food coloring, usually pink or green, then pressed small pieces into rubber or metal molds and turned them out onto wax paper to dry overnight. The mints were soft, creamy, and tasted like butter, sugar, and peppermint with a melt-in-your-mouth texture that dissolved almost instantly. They were delicate, pastel-colored, and looked like tiny works of art. Buttermints disappeared when younger generations stopped keeping candy molds in the drawer and stopped wanting candies that required pressing by hand. The molds gathered dust, and the recipe was forgotten. But if buttermints felt too delicate, what came next was airy and crunchy and tasted like honey instead of sugar. Seafoam candy wasn't regular divinity. It was honey, sugar, and egg whites beaten until the mixture turned pale gold, airy, and tasted like caramelized honey instead of pure white sugar. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made seafoam for special occasions because it was lighter than regular divinity, had a deeper flavor, and looked impressive with its golden color and craggy texture. You boiled honey and sugar to the hard ball stage, poured it slowly into beaten egg whites, then beat the mixture until it thickened, turned glossy, and held soft peaks. You dropped spoonfuls onto wax paper and let them dry overnight. The candy was light, airy, and tasted like honey, vanilla, and burnt sugar with a texture that was chewy crispy and melted slowly. Sea foam disappeared when honey became more expensive, and younger generations stopped wanting to beat egg whites by hand for 20 minutes. The candy that once filled gift tins was forgotten, replaced by chocolate and store-bought treats. But if seafoam felt too light, what came next was salty, crunchy, and covered in chocolate. You melted yourself. Chocolate-dipped Ritz crackers weren't traditional candy. They were buttery, salty crackers dipped in melted chocolate and left to harden into a sweet, salty treat that felt more like a snack than dessert. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made chocolate-dipped Ritz crackers year-round because they were fast, required no special ingredients, and used crackers they already had in the cupboard. You melted chocolate chips in a double boiler, dipped each cracker halfway, placed them on wax paper to cool, then stored them in tins lined with tissue paper. The crackers were buttery, salty, and tasted like chocolate and butter with a crunchy texture that shattered when you bit down. The salt balanced the sweetness and made each bite more addictive. Chocolate-dipped Ritz crackers disappeared when younger generations stopped seeing crackers as candy and stopped wanting to melt chocolate for something so simple. The tins stayed empty, and the recipe was forgotten. But if chocolate crackers felt too casual, what came next was rich, creamy, and required stirring sugar and cream until your arm ached. Pralines made with cream and brown sugar weren't fudge. They were brown sugar, butter, and heavy cream cooked until thick, then beaten until creamy and dropped onto wax paper with whole pecans pressed into each piece. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made pralines for special occasions because they were southern, elegant, and tasted like caramel and butter without needing a candy thermometer. You boiled brown sugar, butter, and cream to the softball stage, removed it from heat, then beat it with a wooden spoon until it thickened and turned creamy. You worked fast, dropping spoonfuls onto wax paper and pressing a pecan half into each piece before it hardened. The pralines were creamy, sweet, and tasted like caramel, butter, and toasted pecans with a texture that was soft, slightly grainy, and melted slowly on your tongue. They were rich, filling, and required eating slowly. The pralines disappeared when younger generations stopped wanting to stand at the stove stirring and stopped trusting themselves to judge doneness by sight and texture instead of temperature. But if pralines felt too rich, what came next was sticky, chewy, and required hands small enough to shape molasses into balls. These 15 candies weren't just recipes, they were rituals that required standing, stirring, dipping, and shaping by hand. But the next 5 deepened this with sensory skills, smell, touch, and chemical cues, showing you were capable by solving kitchen problems through instinct rather than written directions that hid these cues. Popcorn balls with molasses weren't snacks. They were freshly popped corn coated in hot molasses syrup, shaped into balls with buttered hands before the syrup hardened, then wrapped in wax paper and stored in tins. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made popcorn balls year-round because they were cheap, impressive, and used ingredients they already had: popcorn kernels, molasses, sugar, and butter. You popped corn on the stove in a covered pot, boiled molasses and sugar to the hardball stage, poured it over the popcorn in a large bowl, then shaped it into balls with buttered hands while the syrup was still hot enough to burn if you weren't careful. The popcorn balls were sticky, chewy, and tasted like molasses, butter, and burnt sugar with crunchy popcorn throughout. They were dense, heavy, and required chewing slowly to avoid pulling out fillings. Popcorn balls disappeared when microwavable popcorn replaced stovetop popping, and younger generations stopped wanting to shape hot on sticky syrup with their hands. The recipe faded, and the tins stayed empty. But if popcorn balls felt too sticky, what came next was soft, chewy, and sliced thin with a sharp knife. Date nut roll wasn't candy. It was chopped dates, marshmallows, and walnuts cooked together until sticky, rolled into a log while still warm, then chilled and sliced into thin rounds. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made date nut roll year-round because it was elegant, required no thermometer, and looked impressive sliced on a platter. You cooked chopped dates, sugar, and marshmallows in a saucepan until they melted together, stirred in chopped walnuts, then rolled the sticky mixture into a log on a sheet of wax paper and chilled it overnight. You sliced it thin with a sharp knife and served it on trays. The roll was dense, chewy, and tasted like dates, caramel, and toasted walnuts, with a texture that was sticky, grainy, and required chewing slowly. It was sweet, rich, and filling. Date nut roll disappeared when younger generations stopped keeping dates in the cupboard and stopped wanting candies that required rolling by hand. The log was forgotten and the recipe faded, but if date nut roll felt too heavy, what came next was light, layered, and required spreading marshmallow fudge thin before it set. Marshmallow fudge layered in pans wasn't regular fudge. It was chocolate fudge, and white marshmallow fudge poured in layers, swirled together, then cut into squares that looked marbled and impressive. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made layered fudge year-round because it was elegant, required no special equipment, and used marshmallow creme they kept in the cupboard. You made chocolate fudge, poured half into a buttered pan, made white marshmallow fudge, poured it on top, then swirled them together with a knife before they set. You let it cool overnight, then cut it into squares. The fudge was creamy, dense, and tasted like chocolate and vanilla with a smooth, melt-in-your-mouth texture. The layers added visual interest and made each piece feel more special. Marshmallow fudge disappeared when younger generations stopped making fudge from scratch and started buying it in stores instead. The layered technique was forgotten, and the pans stayed empty. But if layered fudge felt too soft, what came next was sharp, spicy, and coated in sugar that sparkled. Candied ginger dipped in sugar wasn't candy. It was fresh ginger root peeled, sliced thin, boiled in sugar syrup until it turned translucent and chewy, then rolled in granulated sugar and left to dry. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made candied ginger year-round because it was elegant, impressive, and helped settle upset stomachs during rich meals. You peeled fresh ginger, sliced it thin, boiled it in water to soften the sharpness, then simmered it in sugar syrup until it turned soft and translucent. You drained the slices, rolled them in sugar, and let them dry on racks overnight. The ginger was spicy, sweet, and tasted like sugar and heat, with a chewy texture that softened as you chewed. It burned slightly on your tongue and left a warm, lingering aftertaste. Candied ginger disappeared when fresh ginger became harder to find in grocery stores, and younger generations stopped wanting candies that tasted spicy instead of sweet. The recipe faded and the ginger went unused, but if candied ginger felt too sharp, what came next was soft, creamy, and required layering caramel, chocolate, and pecans by hand. Caramel pecan turtles weren't store-bought. They were pecan halves arranged in clusters, topped with homemade caramel, then covered in melted chocolate and left to harden into candies shaped like turtles. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made turtles year-round because they were impressive, required no special molds, and tasted like caramel, chocolate, and toasted pecans. You arranged pecan halves in clusters of 3 or 4 on wax paper. Dropped a spoonful of hot caramel on top of each cluster, let them cool slightly, then covered each piece with melted chocolate and let them harden. The turtles were rich, chewy, and tasted like caramel, chocolate, and butter with crunchy pecans throughout. The texture was dense, sticky, and required chewing slowly. They were sweet, filling, and melted slowly on your tongue. Caramel turtles disappeared when younger generations stopped making caramel from scratch and started buying turtles in stores instead. The candy that once filled gift tins was forgotten, replaced by mass-produced versions that tasted nothing like the original. But these first 20 candies were just the beginning. What came next required even more patience, precision, and techniques most modern kitchens have never seen. Fondant, Candy centers hand-dipped weren't store-bought. They were smooth, creamy sugar paste kneaded by hand, shaped into small balls or ovals, flavored with extracts, then dipped one at a time in melted chocolate until each piece was perfectly coated. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made fondant centers year-round because they were elegant, impressive, and required a technique most home cooks never mastered: making fondant from scratch. You boiled sugar, water, and cream of tartar to the softball stage, poured it onto a marble slab or cold surface, then worked it with a spatula until it turned white, smooth, and pliable. You kneaded it like dough, adding drops of peppermint, vanilla, or almond extract, then shaped it into small centers and let them dry overnight before dipping. The dipping process was delicate. You held each fondant center with a dipping fork, submerged it in melted chocolate, lifted it out, tapped the fork gently to remove excess chocolate, then slid it onto wax paper to harden. The fondant was smooth, creamy, and tasted like pure sugar with a faint flavor from the extract. The chocolate shell was thin, glossy, and snapped when you bit down, revealing the soft, melt-in-your-mouth center. The texture was luxurious, elegant, and required eating slowly to appreciate the contrast between the crisp shell and creamy interior. Fondant candy centers disappeared when younger generations stopped wanting to knead sugar paste, stopped keeping marble slabs for candy making, and stopped dipping chocolates by hand. The technique became a lost art, replaced by store-bought chocolates that tasted nothing like homemade fondant. The dipping fork gathered dust in the drawer, the marble slab was sold at estate sales, and the recipe was forgotten. But if fondant felt too delicate, what came next was crunchy, buttery, and required timing so precise that one extra minute ruined the batch. Almond roca wasn't store-bought. It was butter, sugar, and chopped almonds cooked to the hard crack stage, poured thin, then covered with melted chocolate and more almonds while still warm. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made almond roca year-round because it was impressive, tasted expensive, and required no special equipment beyond a candy thermometer and a heavy saucepan. You cooked butter and sugar together over medium heat, in stirring constantly with a wooden spoon until the mixture reached 300 degrees Fahrenheit on the thermometer and turned deep amber. You stirred in chopped almonds, poured the molten toffee onto a buttered baking sheet, spread it thin with a spatula, then immediately spread melted chocolate on top, and sprinkled more chopped almonds over the chocolate before it hardened. The toffee was golden, glossy, and required breaking into jagged pieces once it cooled. The texture was glass-hard, crunchy, and shattered when you bit down. The flavor was intensely buttery, slightly burnt, and tasted like caramel and toasted almonds with a rich chocolate coating. The almonds added crunch and a nutty flavor that balanced the sweetness. It stuck to your teeth and dissolved slowly, coating your mouth with butter and sugar. Almond roca disappeared when younger generations stopped trusting themselves to cook sugar to the hard crack stage without burning it. The timing was unforgiving. 30 seconds too long and the toffee tasted burnt, 30 seconds too short and it stayed chewy instead of crunchy. The candy thermometer became unreliable and the recipe became too risky. The toffee that once filled gift tins was replaced by store-bought versions that cost more and tasted less rich. But if almond roca felt too hard, what came next was soft, swirled, and required rolling dough into spirals that looked impressive but tasted simple. Peanut butter pinwheels weren't cookies. They were vanilla fondant and peanut butter fudge rolled together into spirals, chilled, then sliced into rounds that looked like pinwheels. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made pinwheels year-round because they were impressive, required no baking, and used peanut butter and powdered sugar most people already had in the cupboard. You made white fondant by mixing powdered sugar, butter, and a few drops of cream until it formed a smooth dough, then rolled it out flat between sheets of wax paper. You made peanut butter fudge by mixing peanut butter, powdered sugar, and butter until thick and smooth, then spread it over the fondant layer. You rolled the two layers together into a tight log, wrapped it in wax paper, and chilled it overnight. You sliced it thin with a sharp knife, revealing the spiral pattern inside. The pinwheels were soft, creamy, and tasted like peanut butter and vanilla sugar with a smooth, melt-in-your-mouth texture. The spiral pattern made them look complicated, but the process was simple if you worked quickly and kept everything chilled. The peanut butter layer was dense and slightly salty. The fondant layer was sweet and mild, and together they balanced perfectly. Peanut butter pinwheels disappeared when younger generations stopped making fondant from scratch and stopped wanting candies that required rolling and chilling overnight. The technique was forgotten, the recipe lost, and the pinwheels that once filled gift platters were replaced by peanut butter cups from the store. The wax paper stayed folded in the drawer, and the rolling pin went unused. But if pinwheels felt too sweet, what came next was boozy, dark, and rolled in cocoa powder instead of sugar. Bourbon balls rolled in cocoa weren't candy. They were crushed vanilla wafers, cocoa powder, corn syrup, and bourbon mixed by hand, rolled into balls, then coated in cocoa powder, and stored in tins for a week to let the flavors meld. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made bourbon balls for adult parties because they were no-bake, required no special equipment, and tasted like something adults made for other adults, rich, boozy, and unapologetically strong. You crushed vanilla wafers into fine crumbs with a rolling pin, mixed them with cocoa powder, corn syrup, chopped pecans, and a generous pour of bourbon until the mixture was sticky and held together. You rolled it into small balls with your hands, then rolled each ball in cocoa powder until it was completely coated. You stored them in airtight tins for at least a week before serving. The bourbon balls were dense, moist, and tasted like chocolate, bourbon, and vanilla with a texture that was soft, slightly crumbly, and dissolved slowly on your tongue. The cocoa coating was dry and bitter, which balanced the sweetness inside. The bourbon flavor was strong. These weren't candies for children, and the longer they sat, the more the flavors deepened and intensified. Bourbon balls disappeared when younger generations stopped keeping bourbon in the house for baking and stopped wanting candies that tasted strongly of alcohol. The recipe was seen as old-fashioned, too strong, and too much like something grandparents made. The tins stayed empty, the bourbon bottles went unopened, and the recipe faded from holiday parties. But if bourbon balls felt too strong, what came next was lighter, sweeter, and shaped by hand into tiny mints that melted on your tongue. Chocolate truffles rolled in nuts weren't store-bought. They were heavy cream and dark chocolate melted together into ganache, chilled until firm, then rolled into balls and coated in finely chopped nuts. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made truffles year-round because they were rich, impressive, and tasted like something from a fancy candy shop. You heated heavy cream until it just began to simmer, poured it over chopped dark chocolate, stirred until the chocolate melted completely and the mixture turned smooth and glossy, then chilled it for several hours until it was firm enough to scoop. You rolled small spoonfuls into balls with your hands, then rolled each ball in finely chopped pecans, walnuts, or almonds until completely coated. The truffles were dense, rich, and tasted like pure dark chocolate with a smooth, creamy texture that melted slowly on your tongue. The nuts added crunch and a toasted flavor that balanced the sweetness. They were intensely chocolatey, almost bitter, and required eating slowly to avoid overwhelming richness. Chocolate truffles disappeared when younger generations stopped keeping heavy cream for candy making and stopped wanting candies that required chilling overnight and rolling by hand. Cranberry orange jellies cut into squares weren't Jell-O. They were fresh cranberries, orange juice, sugar, and gelatin cooked together until thick, poured into pans, chilled until firm, then cut into squares and rolled in sugar. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made cranberry orange jellies year-round because they were elegant, tasted like fruit, and used cranberries they kept in the freezer. You cooked fresh cranberries with orange juice and sugar until the berries burst and the mixture thickened, stirred in unflavored gelatin dissolved in water, then poured it into a shallow pan lined with wax paper. You chilled it overnight until it set firm, cut it into small squares with a sharp knife, then rolled each square in granulated sugar until coated. The jellies were bright red, translucent, and tasted like tart cranberries and sweet oranges with a firm, slightly chewy texture. The sugar coating added sweetness and kept them from sticking together. They were refreshing, fruity, and not too sweet, a palate cleanser after rich chocolate and fudge. Cranberry orange jellies disappeared when younger generations stopped using unflavored gelatin for candy making and stopped wanting candies that required cutting and rolling by hand. The recipe faded, the pans stayed empty, and the jellies that once added color and brightness to candy trays were forgotten, replaced by gummy candies that came in plastic bags. But if jellies felt too tart, what came next was soft, buttery, and wrapped in wax paper one piece at a time. Vanilla caramels wrapped in wax paper weren't store-bought. They were sugar, butter, heavy cream, and vanilla cooked to the firm ball stage, poured into pans, cooled, then cut into small rectangles and wrapped individually in squares of wax paper. And grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made vanilla caramels year-round because they were elegant, buttery, and required precision and patience. You cooked sugar, butter, and heavy cream over medium heat, stirring constantly until the mixture reached 248 degrees Fahrenheit on the candy thermometer, removed it from heat, added vanilla, then poured it into a buttered pan. You let it cool completely, cut it into small pieces with a buttered knife, then wrapped each piece in wax paper, twisting the ends to seal. The caramels were golden, soft, and tasted like butter, cream, and vanilla, with a chewy texture that stuck to your teeth and dissolved slowly. They were rich, sweet, and required chewing carefully to avoid pulling out fillings. The wax paper wrapping kept them from sticking together and made them look professional. Vanilla caramels disappeared when younger generations stopped wanting to stand at the stove stirring for 30 minutes and stopped wrapping candies individually by hand. The recipe was too time-consuming, too precise, and too easy to mess up. The caramels were replaced by store-bought versions that cost more and tasted less buttery, and the technique was forgotten. But if caramels felt too plain, what came next was exotic, floral, and dusted with powdered sugar like snow. Turkish Delight dusted with powdered sugar wasn't candy. It was sugar, cornstarch, gelatin, and rosewater or orange blossom water cooked together until thick, poured into pans, chilled until firm, then cut into cubes and rolled in powdered sugar. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made Turkish Delight for special occasions because it was elegant, exotic, and tasted like nothing else on the candy tray. You cooked sugar, water, and cornstarch together until the mixture turned thick and translucent, stirred in gelatin and a few drops of rosewater, then poured it into a pan lined with parchment paper. You chilled it overnight until it set firm, cut it into small cubes with a knife dipped in powdered sugar, then rolled each cube in powdered sugar until completely coated. The Turkish delight was pale, translucent, and tasted like roses, sugar, and something floral with a soft, chewy texture that was slightly sticky. The powdered sugar coating kept it from sticking to your fingers. It was sweet, perfumed, and polarizing. Some people loved it, others couldn't stand the floral flavor. Turkish delight disappeared when younger generations stopped keeping rose water in the cupboard and stopped wanting candies that tasted like flowers. The recipe was seen as too weird, too foreign, and too much like something from a storybook instead of a real candy tray. The rose water dried out, and the recipe was forgotten. But if Turkish delight felt too exotic, what came next was familiar, colorful, and shaped to look like tiny fruits. Marzipan, fruits painted with food coloring, weren't candy. They were almond paste, powdered sugar, and corn syrup kneaded together, shaped by hand into tiny apples, pears, oranges, and bananas, then painted with food coloring to look realistic. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made marzipan fruits for special occasions because they were impressive, elegant. Jan turned candy making into an art project. You kneaded almond paste with powdered sugar and corn syrup until it formed smooth dough, pinched off small pieces, shaped them into fruits with your hands and small tools, then painted them with diluted food coloring using a tiny brush. You added stems made from cloves or green-tinted marzipan, then let them dry on wax paper. The marzipan was dense, sweet, and tasted like almonds and sugar with a smooth, slightly grainy texture that softened as you chewed. The food coloring added no flavor, just color and visual interest. The fruits were tiny, detailed, and looked almost real from a distance. Marzipan fruits disappeared when younger generations stopped keeping almond paste in the cupboard and stopped wanting candies that required painting by hand. The recipe was too time-consuming, too detailed and too much like craft instead of candy. The tiny paintbrushes were lost, and the marzipan fruits were forgotten, replaced by plastic decorations. But if marzipan felt too detailed, what came next was simpler, sweeter, and shaped in molds you pressed by hand. The first 30 candies tested technique, patience, and the willingness to stand at the stove longer than felt reasonable. But the next 10 pushed into rarer territory. Maple cream from pure syrup, peppermint patties made at home, coconut haystacks baked until golden, and sugared almonds tumbled until smooth and shiny. Maple cream candy shaped in molds wasn't syrup. It was pure maple syrup, boiled to the soft ball stage, cooled slightly, then beaten until it turned creamy and pale, poured into rubber molds, and left to harden into candies that tasted like pure maple. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made maple cream candy for special occasions because it was elegant, required only one ingredient, and tasted like nothing else on the candy tray. You boiled pure maple syrup in a heavy saucepan until it reached 235 degrees Fahrenheit on the candy thermometer, removed it from heat, let it cool to lukewarm without stirring, then beat it with a wooden spoon until it turned thick, creamy and pale tan. You poured it quickly into rubber molds shaped like maple leaves or flowers, working fast before it hardened, then let it set at room temperature until firm enough to turn out. The candy was smooth, creamy, and tasted like pure maple with a soft, melt-in-your-mouth texture that dissolved slowly on your tongue. It was sweet, rich, and intensely maple-flavored. No vanilla, no butter, just maple syrup concentrated into candy form. The molds added detail and made each piece look professional and elegant, perfect for gift boxes. Maple cream candy disappeared when pure maple syrup became too expensive for most families to use for candy making, and younger generations stopped wanting candies that required beating by hand and judging doneness by sight and texture instead of temperature alone. The molds gathered dust in drawers, the recipe was forgotten, and the candy was replaced by cheaper alternatives. But if maple cream felt too expensive, what came next was minty, cool, and made at home instead of buying from the store. Peppermint patties made at home weren't York peppermint patties. They were powdered sugar, butter, peppermint extract, and sweetened condensed milk mixed into smooth dough, shaped into discs, chilled until firm, then dipped in melted dark chocolate one at a time. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made peppermint patties year-round because they were easy, impressive, and tasted better and fresher than anything you could buy at the store. You mixed powdered sugar with softened butter, a few drops of peppermint extract, and enough sweetened condensed milk to form smooth, pliable dough, rolled it out flat between sheets of wax paper, cut it into circles with a biscuit cutter or small glass, chilled the discs in the refrigerator until firm, then dipped each one in melted dark chocolate using a fork, tapped off the excess, and placed them on wax paper to harden. The patties were cool, minty, and tasted like peppermint and chocolate with a soft, creamy center that melted slowly on your tongue. The chocolate shell was thin, glossy, and snapped when you bit down, revealing the white peppermint filling inside. They were refreshing, not too sweet, and perfect after a heavy meal, or as a palate cleanser between richer candies. Peppermint patties disappeared when younger generations stopped making candies from scratch and started buying store-bought versions that were cheaper, faster, and good enough. The recipe faded from candy-making traditions, the biscuit cutter went unused, and the patties that once tasted homemade and fresh were replaced by mass-produced versions. But if peppermint patties felt too minty, what came next was crunchy, coconutty, and shaped like haystacks. Chocolate-covered coconut haystacks weren't candy bars. They were shredded coconut, sweetened condensed milk, and vanilla extract mixed together into sticky dough shaped into mounds, baked until the edges turned golden and toasted, then dipped in melted chocolate once cooled. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made coconut haystacks year-round because they were fast, impressive, and used coconut they kept in the cupboard for baking. You mixed shredded coconut with sweetened condensed milk and a few drops of vanilla until the mixture was sticky and held together, dropped spoonfuls onto a baking sheet lined with parchment paper or greased foil, baked them at 325 degrees Fahrenheit until the edges turned golden brown and crispy, let them cool completely. Then dipped the bottoms in melted chocolate and placed them on wax paper to harden. The haystacks were crunchy on the outside, chewy on the inside, and tasted like toasted coconut and chocolate, with a texture that was crispy at the edges and soft in the center. The chocolate coating added richness and kept them from being too sweet, balancing the coconut's natural sweetness with dark, slightly bitter chocolate. Chocolate-covered coconut haystacks disappeared when younger generations stopped wanting coconut candies and stopped baking candies that required dipping by hand. The recipe faded from church bake sales and party trays, and the haystacks were replaced by store-bought coconut candies that tasted processed and artificial instead of fresh and toasted. But if haystacks felt too coconutty, what came next was crunchy, sweet, and came in pastel colors for weddings and parties. Sugared almonds weren't candy. They were whole raw almonds tumbled repeatedly in hot sugar syrup until each nut was coated in a thick, hard candy shell, then polished by hand until smooth, shiny, and colored in pastel shades of pink, blue, green, white, or lavender. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made sugared almonds for weddings and special occasions because they were elegant, looked expensive, and required patience. They were elegant, colorful, and perfect for filling small dishes, gift boxes, and candy jars on special occasion tables. Sugared almonds disappeared when younger generations stopped making them from scratch and started buying Jordan almonds in bags at the grocery store or party supply shops. The technique was too time-consuming, too repetitive, and too easy to mess up. One batch of sugar too hot and the coating turned grainy instead of smooth. But if sugared almonds felt too hard, what came next was buttery, crunchy, and covered in chocolate you spread by hand. English toffee bars with chocolate weren't candy. They were butter, brown sugar, and graham cracker crumbs cooked together into a thick, buttery toffee mixture, poured into pans, covered with a layer of melted chocolate, then cut into bars once cooled. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made English toffee bars year-round because they were easy, impressive, and tasted like expensive toffee without the risk of burning. You melted butter and brown sugar together in a saucepan, stirred in graham cracker crumbs until the mixture was thick and glossy, poured it into a buttered 9 by 13 pan, baked it at 350 degrees Fahrenheit until it bubbled and turned golden, then spread melted chocolate chips over the top while still hot. You let it cool completely, then cut it into bars with a sharp knife or broke it into jagged pieces like brittle. The bars were crunchy, buttery, and tasted like toffee and chocolate, with a graham cracker base that added texture and kept the toffee from being too hard. They were rich, sweet, and required eating slowly to avoid overwhelming your mouth with butter and sugar. English toffee bars disappeared when younger generations stopped baking candies and started buying chocolate bars and toffee from stores instead. The recipe faded from baking traditions, and the bars that once filled gift tins were forgotten, replaced by store-bought treats that came in plastic wrappers and tasted nothing like homemade toffee. But if toffee bars felt too sweet, what came next was floral, delicate, and used for decorating instead of eating. The first 35 candies tested your patience and timing, but the next 5 push into decorative territory: candied violets painted by hand, nougat beaten until your arm gave out, fondant centers dipped one at a time, hard candy drops stored in jars, and lemon drops made with citric acid. Candied violets for decorating weren't candy. They were fresh violet flowers, carefully brushed with beaten egg white, dipped in superfine sugar, then dried until crisp and used to decorate cakes, cupcakes, and fancy candies. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made candied violets in spring because they were elegant, beautiful, and turned flowers into edible decorations that looked impressive on dessert tables. You picked fresh violets from the garden, rinsed them gently, and patted them dry. Brushed each petal carefully with beaten egg white using a tiny paintbrush, sprinkled superfine sugar over them until completely coated, then placed them on wax paper to dry overnight at room temperature until the sugar hardened and the petals turned crisp. The violets were delicate, crisp, and tasted like sugar and flowers with a texture that shattered when you bit down. They were more decoration than candy, but they added elegance, color, and a touch of vintage sophistication to dessert tables and gift boxes. Candied violets disappeared when younger generations stopped keeping fresh violets in the garden and stopped wanting candies that required painting flowers by hand with egg white and sugar. The technique was too delicate, too time-consuming, and too risky. One mistake and the petals bruised or wilted. The recipe faded, and the violets were forgotten, replaced by store-bought edible decorations that came in plastic containers. But if candied violets felt too fancy, what came next was chewy, nutty, and required beating egg whites until your arm ached. Nougat candy with honey and egg whites wasn't store-bought. It was honey, sugar, corn syrup, and egg whites, beaten together until thick and glossy, then mixed with toasted almonds or pistachios, poured into pans lined with edible rice paper, and left to harden into chewy, nutty candy. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made nougat for special occasions because it was elegant, chewy, and tasted like honey, and toasted nuts with a texture that was somewhere between taffy and marshmallow. You boiled honey, sugar, and corn syrup to the hard ball stage, poured it slowly into beaten egg whites while someone else held the bowl steady, beat the mixture until it turned thick, glossy, and held stiff peaks, folded in toasted almonds or pistachios, then poured it into a pan lined with edible rice paper and let it set overnight at room temperature. The nougat was chewy, sweet, and tasted like honey, vanilla, and toasted nuts with a texture that was dense, slightly sticky, and required chewing slowly to avoid pulling out fillings. The rice paper added a subtle crunch and kept the nougat from sticking to your fingers. Nougat candy disappeared when younger generations stopped wanting to beat egg whites by hand for 20 minutes and stopped trusting themselves to judge doneness by sight and texture instead of temperature alone. The recipe faded, the rice paper became impossible to find, and the nougat was forgotten, replaced by candy bars. But if nougat felt too chewy, what came next was smooth, creamy, and filled with fondant centers. Chocolate buttercreams with fondant centers weren't store-bought. They were fondant centers flavored with vanilla or almond extract, shaped into small ovals or balls, left to dry overnight, then dipped one at a time in melted chocolate and placed on wax paper to harden. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made buttercreams for special occasions because they were elegant, impressive, and looked like something from a fancy candy shop. You made fondant from sugar, water, and cream of tartar, kneaded it until smooth and pliable, added a few drops of vanilla or almond extract, shaped it into small centers about the size of a walnut. Let them dry on wax paper overnight until the outside firmed slightly, then dipped each one in melted chocolate using a dipping fork, tapped off the excess, and slid it onto wax paper to harden. The buttercreams were smooth, creamy, and tasted like vanilla and chocolate with a soft, melt-in-your-mouth center that dissolved slowly on your tongue. The chocolate shell was thin, glossy, and snapped when you bit down, revealing the white fondant filling inside. They were elegant, rich, and required eating slowly to appreciate the contrast between the crisp chocolate and creamy center. Chocolate buttercreams disappeared when younger generations stopped making fondant from scratch and started buying boxed chocolates instead. The recipe faded, the dipping fork was lost, and the buttercreams that once marked you as a skilled candy maker were replaced by store-bought versions that tasted waxy and artificial. But if buttercreams felt too soft, what came next was hard, colorful, and stored in glass jars on the counter. Homemade hard candy drops stored in glass jars weren't store-bought. They were sugar, water, corn syrup, and flavoring oil boiled to the hard crack stage, then dropped by spoonfuls onto wax paper to cool into individual hard candies. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made hard candy drops year-round because they were cheap, lasted for months without refrigeration, and required no special equipment beyond a candy thermometer and a heavy saucepan. You boiled sugar, water, and corn syrup to 300 degrees Fahrenheit, removed it from heat, added a few drops of flavoring oil, peppermint, cinnamon, wintergreen, or fruit flavors, and liquid food coloring, then dropped small spoonfuls onto wax paper or buttered baking sheets. You let them cool until hard and glassy, then stored them in glass jars on the counter or in the cupboard. The candies were colorful, hard, and tasted like peppermint, cinnamon, or fruit, with a texture that dissolved slowly on your tongue, turning sharp and intense as the flavor concentrated. They were sweet, refreshing, and required patience to enjoy. You sucked them slowly until they disappeared completely. Hard candy drops disappeared when younger generations stopped making candies from scratch and started buying them in bulk bags at the grocery store. The jars stayed empty, the candy thermometer was lost, and the recipe faded from candy-making traditions, replaced by store-bought hard candies that came in plastic wrappers and tasted artificial. But if hard candies felt too plain, what came next was tart, citrusy, and made with citric acid instead of lemon juice. Lemon drops made with sugar and citric acid weren't store-bought. They were sugar, water, corn syrup, lemon extract, and citric acid boiled to the hard crack stage, then dropped onto wax paper to cool into small, tart, mouth-puckering candies. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made lemon drops year-round because they were refreshing, tart, and required no fresh lemons, just lemon extract and citric acid powder from the pharmacy. You boiled sugar, water, and corn syrup to 300 degrees Fahrenheit, removed it from heat, added lemon extract, yellow food coloring, and a teaspoon of citric acid, then dropped spoonfuls onto wax paper. You let them cool until hard, then rolled them in powdered sugar to keep them from sticking together and stored them in glass jars. The lemon drops were hard, tart, and tasted like lemon and sugar with a sharp, mouth-puckering sourness from the citric acid. They were bright yellow, refreshing, and required sucking slowly to avoid overwhelming your mouth with tartness. The powdered sugar coating softened the initial bite and made them easier to handle. Lemon drops disappeared when younger generations stopped making hard candies from scratch and started buying them in bulk at candy stores. The recipe faded, the citric acid powder became harder to find, and the drops were forgotten. You replaced by mass-produced sour candies that tasted artificial and chemical. But these first 40 candies were just the beginning. What came next required even more patience, precision, and flavors most modern kitchens have never tasted. The first 40 candies required boiling sugar, beating egg whites, and shaping by hand. But the final 20 push into the rarest territory: cashew brittle that burned if you blinked, coconut ice layered pink and white, horehound drops that tasted medicinal, and techniques most modern kitchens have never seen. Cashew brittle with butter wasn't peanut brittle. It was whole roasted cashews, butter, and sugar cooked together to the hard crack stage, poured onto a buttered surface, spread thin, then broken into jagged pieces once cooled. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made cashew brittle for special occasions because it was elegant, tasted more expensive than peanut brittle, and used cashews that were considered a luxury ingredient. You cooked sugar, corn syrup, butter, and water in a heavy saucepan over medium heat, stirring constantly with a wooden spoon until the mixture reached 300 degrees Fahrenheit on the candy thermometer and turned deep amber. You stirred in whole roasted cashews, poured the molten mixture onto a buttered marble slab or metal baking sheet, spread it as thin as possible with a buttered spatula, then let it cool at room temperature until it hardened completely. You broke it into irregular pieces with your hands or a mallet, then stored it in airtight tins lined with wax paper. The brittle was golden, glossy, and tasted like butter, caramel, and roasted cashews with a texture that was glass-hard and shattered when you bit down. The cashews added a buttery, slightly sweet flavor that was milder and less assertive than peanuts. The brittle stuck to your teeth and dissolved slowly, coating your mouth with rich, buttery sweetness. But if cashew brittle felt too expensive, what came next was sweet, two-toned, and looked like something from a fancy British tea shop. Coconut ice wasn't ice cream. It was shredded coconut, sweetened condensed milk, and powdered sugar mixed together into thick dough, divided in half, colored one half pink, and left the other white, then layered in pans and chilled until firm. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made coconut ice year-round because it was easy, impressive, required no cooking, and looked elegant with its two-tone pink and white layers. You mixed shredded coconut with sweetened condensed milk and powdered sugar until it formed a thick, sticky dough that held together, divided the mixture in half, added a few drops of pink food coloring to one half, and mixed until evenly colored. Then pressed the white layer into the bottom of a buttered pan, pressed the pink layer on top, and chilled it in the refrigerator for several hours until firm. You cut it into small squares with a sharp knife and stored it in tins lined with wax paper. The coconut ice was soft, sweet, and tasted like coconut and sugar with a texture that was dense, slightly grainy, and dissolved slowly on your tongue. The pink and white layers made it look fancy and Victorian, like something you'd find in an old-fashioned candy shop or British tea room. It was sweet, rich, and required eating slowly to avoid overwhelming sweetness. One small square was enough to satisfy. Coconut ice disappeared when younger generations stopped making candies that required no cooking and started buying pre-made fudge, truffles, and chocolate instead. The recipe was seen as too simple, too old-fashioned, and too much like something their grandmothers made. The candy that once filled gift tins and looked impressive on tea tables was forgotten, replaced by more modern, chocolate-heavy treats that required less effort and tasted more familiar to younger palates. The technique of layering colored candy dough, simple, visual, and effective, was lost when candy making shifted from homemade to store-bought. The pans stayed empty, the food coloring dried out in the cupboard, and then the coconut sat unused in the pantry until it went stale and was thrown away. But if coconut ice felt too sweet, what came next was bitter, medicinal, and made from an herb most people used for cough syrup. Horehound drops weren't candy. They were dried horehound herb steeped in boiling water, strained, then cooked with sugar and corn syrup to the hard crack stage, and dropped onto wax paper to cool into bitter medicinal candies. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made horehound drops year-round because they were traditional, soothed sore throats, and tasted like something from the 1800s that reminded older generations of their own grandmothers. You steeped dried horehound leaves in boiling water for 20 minutes, strained out the leaves, then cooked the dark brown liquid with sugar and corn syrup to 300 degrees Fahrenheit, stirring constantly until the mixture turned thick and glossy. You dropped spoonfuls onto wax paper, let them cool until hard and glassy, then wrapped each piece in wax paper and stored them in glass jars. The drops were dark brown, hard, and tasted bitter, earthy, and medicinal, with a flavor that was somewhere between root beer, licorice, and cough syrup. They weren't sweet. They were herbal, strong, and polarizing. Some people loved them for their old-fashioned, authentic taste. Others couldn't stand the bitter taste, died. But if horehound drops felt too bitter, what came next was buttery, sweet, and wrapped individually in wax paper. Butterscotch discs wrapped individually weren't store-bought. They were butter, brown sugar, corn syrup, and vanilla cooked to the hard crack stage, poured onto a buttered surface, then cut into small discs with scissors while still warm and wrapped individually in squares of wax paper. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made butterscotch discs year-round because they were buttery, elegant, and tasted like caramel and brown sugar without the risk of burning that came with making caramel from scratch. You cooked butter, brown sugar, corn syrup, and a pinch of salt in a heavy saucepan over medium heat, stirring constantly until the mixture reached 300 degrees Fahrenheit and turned deep golden brown. You removed it from heat, added vanilla, poured it onto a buttered marble slab or metal baking sheet, let it cool for a few minutes until it was firm enough to handle, then cut it into small discs with buttered scissors, working quickly before it hardened completely. You wrapped each disc in a square of wax paper, twisting the ends to seal, then stored them in tins. The discs were golden, hard, and tasted like butter, brown sugar, and vanilla, with a texture that was glassy, smooth, and dissolved slowly on your tongue. They were rich, buttery, and tasted like caramel without the complexity or bitterness of true caramel. Felt too plain, what came next was creamy, nutty, and flavored with maple instead of vanilla. Walnut creams with maple flavoring weren't fudge. They were powdered sugar, butter, cream, and maple extract kneaded together into smooth fondant, shaped into small ovals, are pressed with walnut halves, then left to dry until the outside firmed slightly. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made walnut creams year-round because they were elegant, tasted like maple and toasted walnuts, and looked impressive on candy trays. You mixed powdered sugar with softened butter, heavy cream, and a few drops of maple extract until it formed smooth, pliable dough, kneaded it on a surface dusted with powdered sugar until it was no longer sticky, pinched off small pieces, shaped them into ovals about the size of a walnut, pressed a walnut half into the top of each piece, then placed them on wax paper to dry overnight at room temperature until the outside firmed up slightly while the inside stayed soft and creamy. The creams were soft, sweet, and tasted like maple, butter, and toasted walnuts with a texture that was smooth and creamy and dissolved slowly on your tongue. The walnut half added crunch, a slightly bitter contrast to the sweetness, and made each piece look elegant and finished. They were rich, filling, and required eating slowly to avoid overwhelming sweetness. One piece was enough to satisfy. Walnut creams disappeared when younger generations stopped making fondant candies from scratch and stopped keeping maple extract in the cupboard for baking and candy making. The recipe was seen as too old-fashioned, too plain, but if walnut creams felt too mild, what came next was bright, fruity, and studded with maraschino cherries. The first 45 candies tested patience and skill, but the final 15 push into forgotten flavors and techniques, cherry divinity studded with maraschino cherries, chocolate-dipped apricots, candied citron for fruitcake, peanut clusters with milk chocolate, and candied rose petals painted by hand. These weren't just rare, they were nearly extinct. Cherry divinity with maraschino cherries wasn't regular divinity. It was sugar, corn syrup, and egg whites beaten together until thick and glossy, then folded with chopped maraschino cherries and dropped onto wax paper to cool into pink, fluffy candies. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made cherry divinity for special occasions because it was elegant, colorful, and tasted like cherries and sugar, with a texture that was light, airy, and melted slowly on your tongue. You boiled sugar, corn syrup, and water to the hardball stage, poured it slowly into beaten egg whites while someone else held the bowl steady, beat the mixture with a hand mixer or wooden spoon until it turned thick, glossy, and held stiff peaks, then folded in chopped maraschino cherries, drained and patted dry, dropped spoonfuls onto wax paper, and let them dry overnight at room temperature. The divinity was pale pink, light, and tasted like sugar, vanilla, and sweet cherries, with a texture that was airy, chewy, crispy, and dissolved slowly on your tongue. The cherries added color, fruity flavor, and small bursts of tartness that balanced the sweetness. The texture was delicate. One bite, and it shattered into sweet, sticky pieces that stuck to your teeth and melted gradually. Chocolate-dipped apricots weren't candy. They were dried apricots, whole or halved, dipped in melted dark chocolate, then placed on wax paper to harden into elegant, chewy, fruity treats. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made chocolate-dipped apricots year-round because they were elegant, required no cooking beyond melting chocolate, and used dried apricots that were expensive enough to feel special but not so expensive that they couldn't be used for candy making. You melted dark chocolate in a double boiler, held each dried apricot by one end with a fork or your fingers, dipped it halfway or completely in the melted chocolate, tapped off the excess, then placed it on wax paper to harden at room temperature or in the refrigerator. The apricots were chewy, tart, and tasted like dried fruit and dark chocolate with a texture that was dense, sticky, and required chewing slowly. The chocolate added richness and bitterness that balanced the apricot's natural sweetness and tartness. They were sophisticated, not too sweet, and tasted like something you'd find in a fancy European candy shop instead of something homemade. Chocolate-dipped apricots disappeared when younger generations stopped dipping candies and dried fruit by hand and started buying chocolate-covered fruit in stores. The recipe was seen as too simple, too plain, and too much like something their grandmothers made when they couldn't afford fancier candies. The apricots were replaced by chocolate-covered strawberries, oranges, and other fruits that looked more impressive and tasted more familiar. The double boiler used for melting chocolate was replaced by microwaves that melted chocolate faster but less evenly, often burning it or turning it grainy. The technique of dipping by hand, simple, tactile, and requiring no special tools, was lost when candy making shifted from homemade to store-bought. But if chocolate-dipped apricots felt too simple, what came next was rare, exotic, and used for fruitcake instead of eating plain. Candied citron for fruitcake wasn't candy you ate plain. It was the thick white pith of citron fruit, a large lumpy citrus fruit related to lemons, peeled, boiled repeatedly to remove bitterness, then simmered in heavy sugar syrup until translucent, chewy, and sweet. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made candied citron for fruitcake because it was traditional, required for fruitcake recipes, and couldn't be replaced with anything else. The flavor was unique, slightly bitter, and floral. You peeled the thick white pith from fresh citron, cut it into strips or cubes, boiled it in water 3 or 4 times to remove the intense bitterness, then simmered it in sugar syrup for several hours until the pieces turned translucent, soft, and glossy. You drained them, rolled them in granulated sugar, and let them dry on racks for several days before storing them in jars or using them immediately in fruitcake. The citron was translucent, pale green or white, and tasted like sugar, citrus, and something floral and slightly bitter with a texture that was chewy, dense, and slightly sticky. It wasn't meant to be eaten plain. It was too sweet, too chewy, and too intensely flavored. It was meant to be mixed into fruitcake batter, where it added moisture, flavor, and texture that couldn't be replicated with any other ingredient. Candied citron disappeared when fresh citron fruit became impossible to find in American grocery stores, and younger generations stopped making fruitcake from scratch. The recipe required too much time, too much effort, and too much patience, boiling the pith repeatedly, simmering it for hours, drying it for days. The citron was replaced by store-bought candied fruit that came in plastic containers and tasted artificial, waxy, and nothing like the real thing. The jars that once held homemade candied citron were repurposed for other preserves, and the recipe was lost when the last generation who remembered how to make it died. But if candied citron felt too exotic, what came next was simple, crunchy, and made from peanuts and chocolate. You melted yourself. Peanut clusters with milk chocolate weren't candy bars. They were roasted peanuts mixed with melted milk chocolate, dropped by spoonfuls onto wax paper, then left to harden into small, crunchy, nutty candies that looked rustic and homemade. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made peanut clusters year-round because they were fast, easy, required only 2 ingredients, and tasted like something you'd buy at a candy store but cost a fraction of the price. You melted milk chocolate chips in a double boiler over simmering water, stirring constantly until the chocolate was smooth and glossy, stirred in roasted peanuts, either salted or unsalted depending on preference, until they were completely coated in chocolate, dropped spoonfuls onto wax paper, spread flat on the counter, or baking sheets, then let them cool at room temperature or in the refrigerator until the chocolate hardened completely and the clusters could be lifted off the wax paper without sticking. The clusters were crunchy, sweet, and tasted like roasted peanuts and milk chocolate with a texture that was crispy, nutty, and slightly oily from the peanuts. The milk chocolate was smooth, creamy, and not too sweet, which let the peanut flavor come through without being overpowered. They were simple, satisfying, and required no skill beyond melting chocolate and stirring. Anyone could make them, and they always turned out right. Each cluster was different. Some had more peanuts, some had more chocolate, some were small and some were large, but all of them tasted homemade and fresh, not mass-produced or artificial. Peanut clusters were common in candy tins throughout the 1960s and 70s because they were cheap, used ingredients most people already had in the cupboard, and could be made in large batches in under 30 minutes. They were perfect for gift-giving, church bake sales, and filling candy dishes on coffee tables. They didn't require candy thermometers, special molds, or precise timing. You just melted chocolate, stirred in peanuts, and dropped them onto wax paper. They were foolproof, forgiving, and required no experience or confidence in candy making. Peanut clusters disappeared when younger generations stopped making candies from scratch and started buying peanut clusters in bulk at candy stores, grocery stores, or warehouse clubs. But if peanut clusters felt too plain, what came next was delicate, floral, and made from rose petals most people threw away. Candied rose petals for decoration weren't candy. You ate by the handful. They were fresh rose petals carefully brushed with beaten egg white, dipped in superfine sugar, then dried until crisp and used to decorate cakes, cupcakes, and fancy candies. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made candied rose petals in spring and summer because they were elegant, beautiful, and turned flowers into edible decorations that looked Victorian, romantic, and impressive on dessert tables. You picked fresh rose petals from the garden, making sure they were pesticide-free and safe to eat. rinsed them gently and patted them dry with paper towels, brushed each petal carefully with beaten egg white using a tiny paintbrush, sprinkled superfine sugar over them until completely coated on both sides, then placed them on wax paper to dry overnight at room temperature until the sugar hardened and the petals turned crisp and delicate. The petals were delicate, crisp, and tasted like sugar and roses with a texture that shattered when you bit down, releasing floral flavor and sweetness. They were more decoration than candy, but they added elegance, color, and a touch of vintage sophistication to dessert tables, gift boxes, and homemade candies. They were fragile, beautiful, and required handling carefully to avoid breaking. The process of making candied rose petals was meditative, precise, and required a steady hand. One wrong move and the petal tore, one brush stroke too heavy, and the egg white pooled and made the sugar clump instead of coating evenly. The technique was passed down from grandmother to mother to daughter, learned by watching hands move slowly and carefully, by seeing how much egg white was too much and how much sugar was too little. It was the kind of skill that couldn't be taught from a recipe card. It required practice, patience, and the willingness to waste a few petals learning how to do it right. The rose garden that provided the petals was tended carefully, pruned in early spring, watered in summer, and protected from pests without chemicals because the petals had to be safe to eat. The connection between the garden and the kitchen was direct, immediate, and intentional. But these first 50 candies were just half the story. What came next pushed even deeper into techniques, flavors, and ingredients most modern kitchens have never seen. The first 50 candies were challenging, but the last 10 push into the rarest territory. Flavors like raspberry jelly and brandied cherries, techniques like layering licorice and glazing chestnuts, and ingredients like angelica and lemon peel that most modern kitchens have never heard of. These weren't just forgotten, they were erased. Raspberry jellies cut into diamonds weren't Jell-O. They were fresh raspberries, sugar, lemon juice, and unflavored gelatin cooked together until thick, poured into shallow pans, chilled until firm, then cut into diamond shapes with a sharp knife and rolled in granulated sugar. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made raspberry jellies year-round because they were elegant, tasted like fresh fruit, and looked impressive cut into geometric shapes and dusted with sugar. You cooked fresh or frozen raspberries with sugar and lemon juice until the berries broke down and released their juice, creating a thick, fragrant mixture that filled the kitchen with the smell of summer even in the middle of winter. You strained the mixture through several layers of cheesecloth to remove every single seed, a process that required patience, time, and strong hands to squeeze the cloth and extract every drop of juice without letting seeds slip through. Once strained, you stirred in unflavored gelatin that had been dissolved in cold water and bloomed until thick and spongy, then poured the bright red mixture into a shallow pan lined with parchment paper or wax paper. You chilled it overnight in the refrigerator until it set firm enough to cut cleanly without tearing or sticking to the knife. The next day, you cut it into diamond shapes with a sharp knife, dipped repeatedly in hot water to keep the blade clean, then rolled each piece carefully in granulated sugar until completely coated on all sides. The sugar coating wasn't just decorative, it kept the jellies from sticking together and added a sweet crunch that balanced the tartness of the raspberries. The jellies were bright red, translucent when held up to the light, and tasted like tart raspberries and sugar, with a firm, slightly chewy texture that was somewhere between gummy candy and fruit leather. The sugar coating added sweetness with every bite and kept your fingers from getting sticky. They were refreshing, fruity, and not too sweet, a palate cleanser after rich chocolate and fudge, perfect for serving at the end of a heavy meal or packing in gift boxes between layers of wax paper. The diamond shape made them look elegant, professional, and more impressive than simple squares. It showed that you'd taken the time to make them look special, not just functional. But if raspberry jellies felt too tart, what came next was boozy, dark, and packed in jars instead of eaten fresh. Brandied cherries packed in jars weren't candy. They were fresh, sweet cherries with stems attached, packed into sterilized jars covered with brandy and sugar syrup, then sealed and stored for weeks or months until the cherries absorbed the brandy and turned soft, boozy, and intensely flavored. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made brandied cherries in summer when fresh cherries were in season because they were elegant, impressive, and required no cooking beyond making sugar syrup. The process began in June or July when cherry orchards opened for picking and families drove out to fill baskets with dark red Bing cherries or lighter Rainier cherries, choosing only the firmest, ripest fruit with stems still attached and no bruises or soft spots that would cause them to spoil in the jar. Back home, you washed the cherries carefully, left the stems on because they made the cherries easier to eat with your fingers and looked more elegant floating in the jar, then pricked each cherry several times with a sterilized needle to help them absorb the brandy without bursting or turning mushy. You packed them tightly into sterilized glass jars, the kind with rubber gaskets and wire bales designed for canning and preserving, filling each jar to the shoulder but leaving enough headspace for the liquid to cover the fruit completely. You made sugar syrup by boiling sugar and water together until the sugar dissolved completely and the syrup turned clear. Let it cool to room temperature so it wouldn't crack the cold glass jars. Then added brandy in a 1-to-1 ratio, 1 part syrup to 1 part brandy, using good brandy that cost more than you'd normally spend, but not so expensive that you felt guilty pouring it over fruit. You poured the brandy mixture over the cherries until they were completely submerged, sealed the jars tightly with the rubber gaskets and wire bales, then stored them in a cool, dark place, a basement, a cellar, or the back of a closet, for at least 6 weeks before opening, though some grandmothers waited 3 months or even 6 months to let the flavors deepen and mature. But if brandied cherries felt too boozy, what came next was sweet, layered, and shaped like Easter eggs, even though it wasn't Easter. Coconut cream eggs weren't Easter candy. They were shredded coconut, sweetened condensed milk, powdered sugar and butter mixed together into thick dough, shaped into egg shapes, chilled until firm, then dipped in melted chocolate and left to harden. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made coconut cream eggs year-round for special occasions, weddings, showers, and party trays because they were elegant, looked impressive, and tasted like the inside of a Mounds bar wrapped in chocolate. The process began with mixing shredded coconut, the fine, dry kind that came in plastic bags, not the moist, sweetened kind used for cakes, with sweetened condensed milk, powdered sugar, and softened butter until it formed a smooth, thick dough that was slightly sticky but held together when you pressed it between your hands. You shaped the dough into small egg shapes with your hand, working quickly because the warmth of your hands softened the dough and made it harder to shape if you worked too slowly. Each egg was about the size of a small chicken egg, smooth on the outside and shaped with a slight taper at one end to look realistic. Once all the eggs were shaped, you placed them on a baking sheet lined with wax paper and chilled them in the refrigerator for at least 2 hours until they were firm enough to dip without falling apart or leaving your fingerprints in the coating. Dipping the eggs required patience, a steady hand, and melted dark chocolate that was the right temperature. Too hot and it was thin and drippy. Too cool and it was thick and clumpy. You melted dark chocolate chips in a double boiler, stirring constantly until smooth and glossy, then held each chilled egg with a fork, to submerged it completely in the chocolate, lifted it out carefully, tapped the fork gently against the side of the bowl to remove excess chocolate, then slid it onto wax paper to harden. The chocolate coating had to be thin but complete. No bare spots, no thick drips, no fingerprints. Once all the eggs were dipped, you let them sit at room temperature or in the refrigerator until the chocolate hardened completely and the eggs could be lifted off the wax paper without the chocolate cracking or sticking. But if coconut cream eggs felt too sweet, what came next was green, exotic, and used for decorating fruitcake instead of eating plain. Candied angelica wasn't candy you ate by itself. It was the thick, hollow stems of the angelica plant, a tall, aromatic herb related to celery and parsley, peeled and boiled repeatedly to remove bitterness, then simmered in heavy sugar syrup until translucent, bright green, and chewy. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made candied angelica for fruitcake decoration because it was traditional, required for decorating fruitcakes and fancy desserts, and couldn't be replaced with anything else. The flavor was unique, slightly herbal, and the bright green color was unmistakable and stood out beautifully against dark fruitcake and red candied cherries. The process began in late spring or early summer when angelica plants were tall and the stems were thick, hollow, and full of aromatic oils that smelled like a cross between celery, anise, and something floral and medicinal. You harvested fresh angelica stems when they were young and tender, before they turned woody and tough, cutting them at the base and stripping off the leaves to use for tea or medicinal purposes, while keeping the thick, ribbed stems for candy making. You peeled off the tough outer layer with a vegetable peeler or a sharp knife, revealing the pale green inner flesh that was softer and less fibrous. You cut the stems into long strips about the width of your thumb and 4 to 6 inches long. Then began the long process of removing the intense bitterness that made raw angelica almost inedible. You boiled the stems in fresh water, brought them to a rolling boil, drained them, then repeated the process 2 or 3 more times until the bitterness faded and the stems turned soft and pliable. Each boiling removed more of the bitter compounds and broke down the tough cellulose fibers that made the stems chewy and stringy. After the final boiling, you simmered the stems in heavy sugar syrup, 2 parts sugar to 1 part water, for several hours, stirring occasionally and watching the liquid reduce and the stems turn translucent and glossy as they absorbed the sugar. The syrup had to be thick enough to coat the stems, but not so thick that it crystallized and turned grainy. But if candied angelica felt too exotic, what came next was creamy, minty, and shaped by hand into tiny mints. Cream cheese. Mints with almond extract weren't store-bought. They were softened cream cheese, powdered sugar, and almond extract kneaded together into smooth dough, then shaped by hand or pressed into rubber molds and left to dry until the outside firmed slightly. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made cream cheese mints for weddings, showers, and parties because they were elegant, melted in your mouth, and required no cooking, just clean hands, patience, and the right proportions of cream cheese to powdered sugar to create a dough that was smooth, pliable, and not too sticky or too dry. The process began with softening a brick of cream cheese at room temperature until it was easy to mix, but not so soft that it turned runny and impossible to shape. You mixed the softened cream cheese with powdered sugar, adding it gradually and mixing after each addition until the dough came together and was no longer sticky. The exact amount of powdered sugar varied depending on the humidity, the temperature of the room, and how soft the cream cheese was. Too much, and the mints tasted chalky and dry. Too little, and they stayed sticky and never firmed up. And once the dough reached the right consistency, you added a few drops of almond extract, or peppermint extract, or a combination of both, and food coloring if you wanted pastel-colored mints for a wedding or shower. Pink, green, yellow, lavender, or white for traditional elegance. You kneaded the dough on a surface dusted lightly with powdered sugar until the color was evenly distributed and the dough was smooth and no longer sticky, then pinched off small pieces about the size of a marble and shaped them by hand into balls, ovals, or flattened discs, or pressed them into rubber molds shaped like flowers, leaves, shells, or other decorative shapes. If you used molds, you pressed the dough firmly into the mold to make sure it filled all the details, then turned the mold over and tapped it gently to release the mint onto wax paper. If the mint stuck, you dusted the mold lightly with powdered sugar and tried again. Once all the mints were shaped and arranged on wax paper, you let them sit at room temperature for several hours or overnight until the outside firmed up slightly and developed a thin crust, while the inside stayed soft and creamy. The mints were delicate, soft, and tasted like cream cheese, almond, and sugar, with a texture that dissolved almost instantly on your tongue, melting into a creamy, sweet puddle that tasted like almonds and sugar, with a faint tang from the cream cheese that kept them from being cloyingly sweet. They were light, not too sweet, and left a creamy, almond aftertaste that was more sophisticated and less medicinal than peppermint mints. But if cream cheese mints felt too delicate, what came next was rich, buttery, and sprinkled with sea salt before it hardened. The first 55 candies required patience, skill, and ingredients most kitchens no longer keep. But the final 5 push into the rarest territory: brown sugar caramels with sea salt, candied chestnuts glazed by hand, licorice layers stacked like art, candied lemon peel boiled 3 times, and white chocolate peppermint fudge. Brown sugar caramels with sea salt weren't regular caramels. They were brown sugar, butter, heavy cream, and corn syrup cooked to the firm ball stage, poured into pans, sprinkled with sea salt while still warm, then cooled, cut into squares, and wrapped individually in wax paper. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made brown sugar caramels year-round because they were rich, buttery, and tasted like caramel and molasses, with a subtle saltiness that balanced the sweetness and made each bite more complex and less overwhelmingly sweet than regular caramels made with white sugar. The process began with cooking brown sugar, butter, heavy cream, and corn syrup together in a heavy saucepan, preferably copper or thick-bottomed stainless steel that distributed heat evenly and prevented hot spots that could burn the sugar. You stirred constantly with a wooden spoon, scraping the bottom and sides of the pan to make sure nothing stuck or burned, watching the mixture bubble and thicken and turn darker as it cooked, checking the temperature every few minutes with a candy thermometer clipped to the side of the pan. The mixture had to reach exactly 248 degrees Fahrenheit, the firm ball stage, where a small amount dropped into cold water formed a firm but pliable ball that held its shape but could still be flattened with your fingers. Too low, and the caramels stayed too soft and stuck to your teeth and the wax paper. Too high, and they turned hard and brittle like toffee instead of chewy like caramel. When the mixture reached 248 degrees Fahrenheit, you removed it from heat immediately, added vanilla extract, which hissed and steamed when it hit the hot sugar, stirred it in quickly, then poured the molten caramel into a buttered 9 by 13 pan, spreading it quickly with a buttered spatula before it started to set. While the caramel was still warm and slightly soft, you sprinkled coarse sea salt over the top, not table salt, which was too fine and dissolved too quickly, but coarse sea salt with large, irregular crystals that stayed visible and crunchy, and added a sharp, mineral-rich saltiness that made the caramel taste less sweet and more sophisticated. You let the caramel cool at room temperature for several hours, or overnight until it was firm enough to cut cleanly without tearing or stretching, then cut it into small squares with a sharp knife dipped in hot water and dried between cuts to keep the blade clean. You wrapped each square individually in a small square of wax paper, twisting the ends tightly to seal and keep the caramel from drying out or sticking to other pieces. The wax paper squares had to be cut precisely. Too small, and you couldn't twist the ends. Too large, and they looked sloppy and unprofessional. But if brown sugar caramels felt too rich, what came next was rare, expensive, and required glazing whole chestnuts in sugar syrup for days. Candied chestnuts glazed with sugar weren't candy. They were fresh chestnuts, peeled, boiled until tender, then simmered in sugar syrup for days until they absorbed enough sugar to turn translucent, glossy, and intensely sweet. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made candied chestnuts for special occasions because they were elegant, expensive, and tasted like something from a French patisserie, not something you made at home in an American kitchen. The process began in late fall when fresh chestnuts were in season and available at specialty markets or Italian groceries, sold by the pound in burlap sacks or wooden crates, still in their glossy brown shells with the fuzzy inner skin clinging to the nut inside. You scored each chestnut with a sharp knife, cutting an X into the flat side to keep them from exploding when they boiled, then boiled them in water until the shells softened and started to split open along the cut. You drained them, let them cool just enough to handle without burning your fingers. Then began the long, frustrating process of peeling away the hard outer shell and the thin, papery inner skin that clung stubbornly to every crevice and required picking at with your fingernails or a paring knife until the pale yellow nut was completely clean. Some chestnuts peeled easily, the shell and skin coming off in large pieces. Others required 10 minutes of careful work to remove every bit of brown skin without breaking the nut into pieces. Once all the chestnuts were peeled, a process that could take an hour or more for a pound of nuts, you simmered them in light sugar syrup, 1 part sugar to 2 parts water, for several hours, keeping the heat low and the syrup barely bubbling to avoid breaking the chestnuts apart. After the first day, you drained the syrup, made a slightly stronger syrup, equal parts sugar and water, and simmered the chestnuts again. You repeated this process every day for 3 to 5 days, gradually increasing the sugar concentration until the chestnuts had absorbed so much sugar that they turned translucent, glossy, and almost jewel-like when held up to the light. On the final day, you made a very thick sugar syrup, brought it almost to the soft crack stage, then dipped each chestnut individually into the hot syrup and placed it on a wire rack to dry. The syrup hardened into a thin, glossy glaze that looked like glass and cracked delicately when you bit down, revealing the soft, sweet chestnut inside. But if candied chestnuts felt too expensive, what came next was colorful, layered, and required stacking different flavors of candy on top of each other like building blocks. Licorice all sorts. Homemade layers weren't store-bought. They were layers of black licorice paste, coconut fondant, and colored sugar paste stacked together, pressed flat, chilled, then cut into small squares that looked like the British candy but tasted homemade, fresh, and more intense than anything you could buy in stores. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made homemade licorice all sorts year-round for parties, gift boxes, and candy trays because they were impressive, colorful, and required skill, patience, and steady hands to layer different flavors and textures without them sliding apart, mixing together, or looking messy and unprofessional. The process began with making 3 different candy doughs: black licorice paste, white coconut fondant, and colored sugar paste, each with its own texture, flavor, and consistency that had to be just right to stack and press together without falling apart. You made black licorice paste first by mixing powdered sugar, corn syrup, and a generous amount of licorice extract, the real kind made from licorice root, not the artificial anise flavoring that tasted similar but wasn't the same, until it formed a smooth, pliable, slightly sticky dough that smelled intensely herbal, medicinal, and polarizing. Some people loved it. Others couldn't stand the smell and left the kitchen while you worked. You kneaded it on a surface dusted lightly with powdered sugar until it was no longer sticky and held together without cracking. Then set it aside while you made the coconut fondant. The coconut fondant was made by mixing shredded coconut with sweetened condensed milk and powdered sugar until it formed a thick, sticky dough that tasted like pure coconut and sugar, with a texture that was slightly grainy from the coconut but smooth enough to press flat. You kneaded it until it was smooth and pliable, then set it aside while you made the colored sugar paste, regular fondant, made with powdered sugar, butter, and cream, divided into portions and colored with food coloring, pink, yellow, green, or any color you wanted, to create layers that looked like stripes or checkerboards when the candy was cut. Once all 3 doughs were ready, you began the careful process of layering them. You rolled out the licorice paste between sheets of wax paper until it was about a 1/4 inch thick and roughly rectangular, then rolled out the coconut fondant to the same thickness and size, placed it carefully on top of the licorice layer, pressed down gently to make sure there were no air bubbles, then added a layer of pink sugar paste, another layer of coconut fondant, and another layer of licorice paste, building the layers like a sandwich until you had 5 or 6 layers total. But if licorice all sorts felt too complicated, what came next was bright, citrusy, and required boiling lemon peel 3 times to remove the bitterness. Candied lemon peel in sugar syrup wasn't candy. It was thick strips of lemon rind boiled repeatedly to remove bitterness, then simmered in sugar syrup until translucent, chewy, and tart-sweet. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made candied lemon peel year-round because it was elegant, used something that would otherwise be thrown away as garbage, and tasted tart, sweet, and intensely lemony in a way that fresh lemon juice or lemon extract couldn't replicate. The process began with choosing the right lemons, thick-skinned lemons with lots of pith, like Eureka or Lisbon lemons, not thin-skinned Meyer lemons that were too delicate and didn't have enough pith to turn into chewy, substantial candy. You peeled the lemons with a sharp vegetable peeler or a paring knife, and taking off thick strips of yellow rind and leaving as much of the white pith attached as possible, because the pith was what gave the candy body texture and substance. You cut the strips into long, narrow pieces about the width of a pencil and 4 to 6 inches long, then began the long process of removing the intense bitterness that made raw lemon peel almost inedible and mouth-puckeringly sour. You placed the strips in a large pot, covered them with cold water, brought the water to a rolling boil, then drained them and repeated the process. You boiled and drained the strips 3 times, sometimes 4 times if the lemons were particularly bitter, each time removing more of the bitter compounds and breaking down the tough cellulose fibers that made the pith chewy and stringy. After the final boiling, the strips were soft, pliable, and no longer intensely bitter, still tart, still lemony, but no longer overwhelming or unpleasant to taste. You made a sugar syrup by boiling sugar and water together until the sugar dissolved completely and the syrup turned clear, then added the drained lemon strips and simmered them gently over low heat for several hours, stirring occasionally and watching the liquid reduce and the strips turn translucent and glossy as they absorbed the sugar. The syrup had to be thick enough to coat the strips, but not so thick that it crystallized and turned grainy and sandy instead of smooth and glossy. Some grandmothers added a vanilla bean or a cinnamon stick to the syrup to add flavor. Others left it plain to let the lemon flavor shine through without competition. Once the strips were translucent and had absorbed as much syrup as they could hold without falling apart, you lifted them out carefully with a slotted spoon or tongs, drained them on wire racks, set over baking sheets to catch the drips, then rolled each strip in granulated sugar to keep them from sticking together and to add a sweet, crunchy coating that balanced the tartness of the lemon. You laid them flat on parchment paper to dry for several hours or overnight until the outside firmed up and the inside stayed chewy and slightly sticky. But if candied lemon peel felt too tart, what came next was the final candy: white chocolate, peppermint, and everything that made special occasions taste festive and memorable. White chocolate peppermint fudge wasn't regular fudge. It was white chocolate chips, sweetened condensed milk, and peppermint extract cooked together until smooth, poured into pans, sprinkled with crushed candy canes, then chilled, until firm and cut into squares. Grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s made white chocolate peppermint fudge for special occasions because it was fast, impressive, looked festive with red and white swirls that reminded everyone of peppermint sticks and candy canes, and tasted like white chocolate and peppermint in perfect balance. Not too sweet, not too minty, not too rich, just exactly right. The process began with melting white chocolate chips with sweetened condensed milk in a double boiler or a heavy saucepan set over low heat, stirring constantly with a wooden spoon or a silicone spatula to make sure the chocolate melted evenly and didn't scorch or turn grainy and separated. Our white chocolate was temperamental and required more careful attention than dark or milk chocolate. Too much heat, and it seized and turned into a grainy, lumpy mess that couldn't be salvaged. Too little heat, and it took forever to melt and never turned completely smooth. You stirred patiently, scraping the bottom and sides of the pan, watching the chocolate soften and melt and blend with the condensed milk until the mixture was smooth, glossy, and thick enough to coat the back of the spoon. Once the mixture was completely smooth with no lumps or streaks of unmelted chocolate, you removed it from heat, added a few drops of peppermint extract, starting with less than you thought you'd need because peppermint extract was powerful and a little went a long way, stirred it in thoroughly, tasted the mixture on the tip of your finger, and added more extract if needed until the peppermint flavor was strong enough to taste, but not so strong that it burned your tongue or tasted like toothpaste. Some grandmothers added a few drops of red food coloring to half the mixture and swirled the pink and white together to create a marbled effect. Others left it pure white and let the crushed candy canes provide the color and visual interest. You poured the fudge into a buttered 9 by 13 pan, or a smaller pan if you wanted thicker pieces, spread it quickly and evenly with a buttered spatula before it started to set, then sprinkled crushed candy canes or peppermint candies over the top, while the fudge was still warm and slightly soft, so the pieces stuck to the surface instead of rolling off. You pressed the candy pieces gently into the fudge with the back of the spatula to make sure they adhered, then placed the pan in the refrigerator to chill for several hours or overnight until the fudge was firm enough to cut cleanly without tearing, sticking, or leaving your knife coated with sticky white chocolate. The next day, you lifted the fudge out of the pan using the edges of the parchment paper, or foil as handles, placed it on a cutting board, and cut it into small squares with a sharp knife dipped in hot water and dried between cuts to keep the blade clean and the edges neat. Each square was white and creamy, with flecks of red and white candy cane pieces on top that added crunch, color, and extra peppermint flavor that made each bite taste refreshing, festive, and like everything good about special occasions condensed into one perfect piece of candy. These 60 candies weren't just recipes. They were traditions, skills, and memories that disappeared when candy making shifted from homemade craft to store-bought convenience.